Some people talk about it as a horror comic. I actually don't see it that way. First of all, because it isn't really that horrific. It certainly is funny, but it's not a comic. A comic implies a kind of shorthand and lack of depth. And Sandy didn't work like that. I mean, all his films, and particularly The Lady Killers and The Man in a White Suit, are kind of so carefully thought out and so structured that I think calling them a horror comic would be a mistake. Mrs. Wilberforce fascinates me because she's clearly somebody you think was a complete prig and a complete pain in the backside, and yet she's wonderfully sympathetic. Not really because of her moral stance, but because of the absolute serenity of her certainty about how life works. And I think one of Sandy's gifts as a director was that he was an outsider. He was British, but he wasn't British. He was American-born, as I'm sure everyone knows. But he looked at England particularly like somebody who was just visiting from another planet. And Mrs. Wilberforce is a quintessentially English figure. And therefore he had fun with her. I mean, she is the certainty that created the empire and also the idiot that lost the empire. Sandy used to think that comedy was the best way of not making life unbearable. Sorry to use the double negative. His films were always a mix, and that includes even the non-comedies, films like Sweet Smell of Success, which I think was his masterwork, probably along with The Lady Killers and Man in a White Suit. But he used to make them this extraordinary mixture of humanity, something very cool, almost cold about some of his films, a kind of intellectual rigor, and a mordant sense of humor. And there's no question that if you just had the headline mordant sense of humor, that is the key to The Lady Killers. But he used to say something, or he said something to me, that laughter without sympathy is intolerable. Laughter at yourself, at your own pain and your own faults is acceptable, and it's the best kind of joke. And in a curious way, that's what he gave us in The Lady Killers, was the best kind of joke. Sandy used color very well, but above all, he used design and shape. There are marvelous jump cuts in The Lady Killers, and to things that you can't quite understand what you're looking at, and then as the camera pulls out, you're oh, that's the bridge with the train. They're brilliantly composed shots. The film is full of them. POVs from behind Professor Marcus's shoulder that you don't expect. So as a designer, which of course he was an artist himself, Sandy, and a designer, the film is full of those pleasures. I don't think color was particularly one of them. And I think, a lot of people were struggling to use color for the first time, basically just said, oh, it's in color, and went ahead and shot it as if it was in black and white. Alec Guinness gave so many wonderful performances for people of my age that I can't single one out. I mean, I love his performance in The Lady Killers. On the other hand, I can think of at least 3 others that I liked equally. I know that one of the things in The Lady Killers that finally persuaded Alec Guinness to do it was when he devised the notion of the teeth. Had he not got that, I don't think he knew how to play Professor Marcus. The moment he got it, it worked perfectly. And a tribute to him and to Sandy, they didn't overuse the gag of the silly projecting teeth. I think The Lady Killers is co-equal best of his Ealing comedies. People always ascribe Whiskey Galore, or Tight Little Island as it's called in America, to the Ealing period. In fact, it predated Ealing, or he was not in the Ealing circle at that time. I think it's co-equal. I think Lady Killers is co-equal with The Man in a White Suit. Man in a White Suit was politically more self-conscious, more conscious, was less fun, and yet in its way was a more important film. On the other hand, The Lady Killers has the quiet pleasure of laughter all the way through it. Sandy used to say that the gift of irony, which he always remarked was characterized in Robert Burns's line, to see ourselves as others see us. The gift of irony was probably the saving grace of mankind. And if irony is the saving grace of mankind, then almost certainly The Man in the White Suit and The Lady Killers helped to save mankind. I don't think any of Sandy McKendrick's films have dated at all. It's quite extraordinary. He made a black and white film post-Ealing called Mandy, about a child, a baby, who parents discover is completely and totally deaf. And it is as relevant today, it is as cleanly shot. It could have literally been made by the BBC documentary unit last month. And that's a film made in the early 50s, so we're talking about nearly 60 years ago. So I think there's something absolutely undating about Sandy's work, as there should be if films deal with eternal truths about humankind and the way in which we interact. Sandy thought very, very carefully about every single shot and every movement of the camera, and he thought equally carefully about every scene in the script. I worked with him when I was a very young man. He'd read a script of mine, and we had the great pleasure of working together for about 3 weeks. And what we did was, each scene was reduced to a single card, so that there were about 110 cards laid out on the floor. And Sandy, who by that time had become even more familiar with the script than me, would sit there and swoop on a card and say, what if we move this scene to here? Or let's take this scene back and put it, and he would just endlessly experiment until you got the exact pattern that felt right to him. And he was like that as a director. He changed his mind all the time, serially. And by the way, I think that's one of the reasons he made so few films, was that he was constitutionally incapable of being a definitive about anything, the result of which was that his films took a long time to make and a long time to set up. While he was not one of those who came through writing or came through photography into directing, he came through being a designer and an artist. I'll bet you that working on the storyboard of a film led him to thinking about the structure of the film. And I suspect that's where Sandy became such an important structuralist in the films he made. He sometimes revised his own history in exactly the way that I've already described. He can't make up his mind. The great sculptor Giacometti used to spend hours and weeks refining a sculpture, and it would get smaller and smaller and smaller, to the point where basically people had to take it away from him, otherwise it disappeared. And I think Sandy's a bit like that. He would reassess and re-examine and re-evaluate every film he made, looking for all the weak points, and I think he overdid that because his films are their own evidence of his skill and brilliance as a director. I only worked with him briefly, and then when I did a long interview with him for the BBC, he was an absolute delight. He was a sweet and lovely man who'd had a very difficult life. He had a lot of struggle, both personally and professionally, and he was just always willing to open his huge fountain of knowledge to other people. It made him a great teacher. I talked to several of the students at the Cal Arts Film School where he was the dean, and they all worshipped him because of his, not just because of his insights into filmmaking and his ability to convey those, but just the sheer commitment that he had to passing on the knowledge that he had gained.